Hi, welcome to this presentation on anxiety. I think this is a way of thinking about and understanding your anxiety that will be really helpful for your recovery. And we're going to look at the physiological response, which is completely linked with anxiety. And it impacts every single physiological system in the human body. And the symptoms can be very, very intense and very scary. So, we're going to talk about why this happens, which understanding this can be very helpful. Then, we're also going to look into some really interesting research on what happens to us physically when we watch movies. And there's a direct parallel to what happens to us physically when we follow the movie in our head, the anxious thoughts, the projections in our own brains. And then we're going to talk about how to recover. What do you do about this? How do you lower your anxiety? So, if you've watched my other videos, I'm hoping are familiar with this is really the cognitive behavioral therapy cycle. This is focusing on anxiety, but that basically your thoughts impact your feelings and your behaviors. Feelings impact thoughts and behaviors impact thoughts and feelings. So all of these things cycle. And we generally think about anxiety as starting with a problem. So an external problem comes at us. Many of us respond with thoughts. I'm going to give a little more detail on this. And then that feeds the anxious cycle. However, for some people, it could actually be sensory information that comes in. It could just even be a smell. It could be a sight, a sound, and that can directly trigger a feeling of anxiety. So this does not always start with thoughts. And to be honest, it matters in terms of your own cycle, which will be part of the healing I'll get into at the end of today. But it doesn't really matter where your cycle starts, it will all cycle. So hopefully that will be clear by the end of this. Let me know. So I'm going to start with the example of the problem that comes in. Now, generally, the problems that will impact your anxiety, and I'm actually going to have to put my glasses on to keep going through this so I can make sure to be giving you information related to the slide I'm showing. All right. So, generally, the problems that cause us anxiety are those that have a lot of uncertainty. We are focused on an outcome. There's like a particular outcome we want, the happiness, the job we want to get, the successful, whatever we think it is that's successful. So there's an outcome that we don't have totally have control over, right? Elements outside of your control. And we are projecting into the future. We really want that outcome, but we can't necessarily control it. Lots of uncertainty. And we really begin to project into the future. So that is sort of the basis of cognitive anxiety, right? The anxiety that starts with our thoughts. And so what I'm describing is that it's leading to some kind of catastrophic thinking, right? Some kind of, oh, I'm going to run into this problem, that problem, this problem. I want to prevent all these problems. None of them are occurring now, so I can't actually now prevent any of them, but I want to anticipate all of them. And this is just fueling more and more anxiety. So, as we're fueling that anxiety and that catastrophic thinking, we are generating physical symptoms. And these are physical symptoms. There are fight, flight, and freeze response. This is driven by the amygdala, by some very primitive parts of the brain. And all of these physical symptoms are basically convincing the rest of us that we really do need to be anxious, right? It's almost like the physical symptoms reinforce that drive to have all this anxious thinking. So it convinces all of you that you need your fight, flight, and freeze response. This increases your anxious thoughts and it increases anxious behaviors. So if we go back to that cycle, right? Thoughts, feelings, behaviors, they all contribute to, and then things spiral out of control. So we're going to talk about why the catastrophic thinking causes those physical symptoms. And then also, I just want to mention here that whether your anxiety starts with that external problem that leads to catastrophic thinking, or it starts with those physical feelings, right? It starts with some kind of sensory information that comes in, and then you begin to have a panic attack, right? So a lot of people will say, well, I wasn't anxious. I wasn't thinking about something anxious. And all of a sudden, I just started to have this panic. But then once you have those physical symptoms, then once you pay attention to this, you'll begin to see the cycle. Because once you have those physical symptoms, then you go into the cognitive worry, the, "Oh, no, why am I having this symptom? Oh, something must be wrong with me. Maybe this really isn't anxiety. Maybe there's something else wrong with me." If we were able to feel some of those physical symptoms and just be like, "Oh, okay, that's happening again," and not worry about it, then it wouldn't be feeling this cycle. So I hope that makes sense. And I am going to come out and I'll talk about at the end of this a little bit more about why that happens when your anxiety is triggered by some kind of sensory information. You may not even be consciously aware of it. All right. So we evolved, evolved, and our brains evolved with a primary focus on survival. So our brain developed to keep us safe and to keep us alive. And the amygdala, which has a key role in this, primes us to fight, flee, or freeze whenever there is a threat. And key point here, the amygdala cannot differentiate between real and imagined threats. So I'm circling it here on the slide. The amygdala cannot differentiate between real and imagined threats. So that's where we need our frontal lobe to come in, calm that amygdala down, and be like, okay, this is not actually a dinosaur chasing me. And I do have a bunch of videos. Again, I'll talk about them at the end of today, and I'll link some at the end today about when we get triggered by our amygdala, what an amygdala hijack is. All of that will be very useful if you have an interest in this point. But that's the key here. The made up stories are triggering the same physical response as if this was actually happening. All right. So let's think about movies. We know they're not real, yet we still respond physiologically. I'm someone who jumps all the time in a movie if something scary happens or shocking or whatever. Or, I definitely have a very external expression of it. Not everybody does, but many people do. But we all feel something. So the research right now on movies and what's happening in our brain and our body, very interesting. But basically, the research is demonstrating that there are measurable physical responses to what's happening in a movie. We all know they're not passive responses, passive experiences, I mean, but the fact that they actually trigger things we can measure, hormonal changes, electrodermal activity. So, electrodermal activity is like measuring the amount of sweat on your skin. And these are really, really subtle changes, but that changes with different emotions. So that's one of the tools that researchers are using to see what physiological changes are happening in humans tied to emotions when they're watching movies. So heart rate and blood pressure is being measured during movies, and there's actually a lot of studies now with fMRIs looking at brain imaging, looking at the activity in your brain while you watch a movie. So, when we watch a scary movie, our innate fight, flight, and freeze response is activated. This is preparing you for immediate danger, even though the danger is not real and you know it's not. You know you're watching a movie. So, the danger is also not physical, it's not physically in front of you, right? The getting scared by the story triggers measurable spikes in adrenaline and cortisol levels, which are our stress chemicals. So I think this is really, and I'm going to give you a little more research here, but really a powerful example of how our bodies respond to imaginary threats. And they do this the same way with those anxious, made up stories in our minds. So there's also positive research on the movies in terms of positive impacts on us. Watching comedies and laughing actually lowers your blood pressure. Very good to keep in mind. We should all watch more comedies, right? Heart rates can actually reach 40 to 80% of their maximum rate, which is where, doctors recommend you get exercise in that range. And that can be, experienced for an extended time in a movie. So that could actually be a positive. And another key here is that the heart rates and the electrodermal activity, all of the physiological data goes up and down with the narrative arc. So as the story changes, as the narrative changes, so do people's physiology. There's actually some research showing that audience heartbeats, the heartbeats of the people in the audience, begin to beat in synchrony with each other, which is really interesting. And it also makes me think about when we're next to somebody who's anxious, we probably feel more anxious, right? We pick up on each other's moods, emotions, and physiological states sometimes. So they're tracking how that happens in a movie. And then fMRI studies are showing that stressful movies can actually trigger the same neural circuits involved in anxiety. So they're triggering the same circuitry in your brain, the pieces that are wiring together are the same that wire together during anxious feelings. So, movie watching is actually recreating emotional states so accurately. Like, movie watching is accurately recreating emotional states we feel when we are actually living our lives, right? That there are more and more fMRI studies looking at the brain function during a movie, mapping the brain areas that highlight with different emotional states. And they're using this in their studies of affective and emotional disorders. And this includes anxiety. So, really kind of interesting, but definitely ties to those made up stories. Okay, so what do you do about this? So, how to calm your anxiety. Now, I do have a ton of videos on this. I'm going to give you some highlights here and then also point to areas you might want to investigate a little bit more towards the end. So, in order to calm your anxiety, number one, increase your awareness of the connection between your thoughts and feelings. Use this awareness, use that growing awareness to separate the physical feeling from the made up story. And I say made up story in quotes because I know, again, it is a real problem, but it's being projected into the future where what you're worrying about isn't happening like right this moment, right? So separate that physical response you're having as much as you can from those thoughts. The intense physical response that's triggered by catastrophizing is not congruent with the present moment. Present moment, right now, sitting here in this environment, right? And it's also not needed to solve the problem. In fact, it can get in your way of actually solving the problem. Okay, my second suggestion here is to really understand your anxiety cycle. Does your cycle start with problems, external problems? Does it start with internal feelings? Does it start with some kind of sensory experience that's external, right? What types of events are triggering it, right? What are you anticipating? And then how's that impacting your thoughts, feelings, behaviors? And how does this cycle work for you? So, behaviors, again, I talk about this more in other videos, but you can have behaviors that contribute to the anxiety, or you can have behaviors that help you calm down. So, I'll mention a little more on this in a moment. But basically, really becoming intimately aware of the cycle of anxiety for you. So, number three, prioritize calming your physical system. Directly calming your physiological state is one of the most powerful interventions. Really, it is. It really communicates to the older parts of your brain, to that amygdala, and some of these more ancient areas that don't actually have language centers. It communicates to them that you are actually safe enough. And super important tools, these are foundational tools, diaphragmatic breathing and grounding techniques. And I recommend that people practice these regularly, like on a daily basis, not necessarily, or actually better to do it when you're not super anxious. Like just begin to do them regularly on a regular basis every day. And then you'll have the ability to access them when you're in a more anxious state. So it really builds over time. It's a habit, just like a muscle, that gets stronger and stronger. So number 4 is to identify those behaviors that contribute to your anxiety, to your anxious cycle, and identify those that break the anxious cycle. So really begin to think about how do your behaviors, whether if they're compulsive or avoidant, they're contributing to your anxiety. If you're afraid of something and you avoid it, you're communicating to this old brain, yeah, really scary. I better run away. So really identify what those behaviors are and what behaviors you can put in place to cut the cycle, to calm yourself down, to change the pathways. So, behavior is actually the most powerful way to change your brain circuitry. It can create new neural pathways. So, habitual physical reactions get different brain regions working together really fast. Your brain will develop neural pathways. This event leads to this feeling, leads to this thought, and it gets faster and faster the more you do it. So habits of anxiety and habits of relaxation, really important. So, one thing you could practice, which this is just one idea of many, but you can practice actually calming your body while you're thinking about the situation that is frightening you, triggering you, causing you anxiety, worrying you, right? So, think about that situation and do some of that diaphragmatic breathing or do some of the grounding and think about it and see what happens. Oops, moved past it quicker than I wanted to, but that's okay because I have a free webinar. Wanted to throw this in and then I'll go back and finish my point. So, this webinar goes into this concept of your neural pathways and what you can do to change them so that you can feel less anxious, so you can focus more on joy, rewire things, what behaviors you have to change. I think you'll find it really helpful. It's free. The link's in the description. Link is also on the screen. So that's a resource to take advantage of. So yeah, so okay, the last slide, which I moved all too fast. So when you move with behaviors, right? Just really pay attention to what behaviors can you put in place that will help you break the cycle. And those behaviors can include the diaphragmatic breathing and the grounding techniques. And it can also include, taking a walk, which relaxes you, petting an animal, that type of thing, right? So I know that some people watching this video would like more information on the actual physical symptoms of anxiety, but I felt like it was too much to put all in one video. So my next video coming out is going to be on the physical symptoms of anxiety. So make sure you subscribe to my channel. And by the way, hit that like button if you have received any value from this video. It is really helpful for me and helps me continue to make the content, continue to spread this information worldwide. And then the other question I think a lot of viewers are going to have is, hey, I don't have a story, right? So those people who feel like the anxiety is triggered by an internal feeling or by some kind of external sensory information, they often feel like, no, there was no story. There was no story when I started. So again, thought this would just get way too long if I put it all in one. So the next video after the physical symptoms will be on what if there is no story? And in that video, I'm actually going to talk about how experiences in the past get linked, or I should say, the experiences in the past link sensory information with an emotional response. So those things get deeply embedded in our brain. These things can be positive or they can be negative. So positive sensory experiences can bring up emotion, right? Like a smell that, of your grandmother's cooking or something like that really was meaningful and wonderful for you can trigger emotion. But also for people who tend towards anxiety, a lot of things can trigger anxiety, and that might be stuff that kind of runs underneath the surface. Like you may not even be consciously aware of it. So I'm going to talk about that in the video, 2 from now, I guess. Okay. So let me know what questions you have here. If you have questions you'd like me to address in a future video, let me know if the cycle makes sense. Let me know if you found that movie research interesting. I definitely did. And I look forward to seeing you next time. And I'm also going to put here on the screen some of the other videos you might want to just click on and watch right now because I think they'll be really helpful. Okay, take care.